Hello and welcome to our London History Podcast, where we share our love of London, its people, places and history. This podcast is designed for you to learn things about London that most Londoners don't even know, all in 20 minutes. I'm your host, Hazel Baker, qualified London tour guide and CEO of londonguidedwalks.co.uk. Show notes plus photos or recommended reading transcripts can be found on each associated episode's webpage. Simply go to londonguidedwalks.co.uk/podcast. Don't forget, if you enjoy what we do, then please rate and review. It warms the cockles of my heart to read your appreciation of this labour of love. Get that cup of tea, put your feet up, and enjoy. Like many other places in London, Covent Garden has evolved over the years. It started from humble beginnings as a convent garden for Westminster Abbey. It has moved through many guises over the centuries. From a home to the aristocracy and the main centre of theatrical life in London, it developed into the largest produce market in the world. The rapid expansion of the market altered the character of the area. Along with a bustling commercial market, two theatres, the First Theatre Royal on Drury Lane and the Royal Opera on Bow Street, were built. Each theatre had letters patent granted by Charles II, allowing them to be the only London theatres able to perform spoken drama. This made Covent Garden London's theatrical centre, attracting droves of theatre-goers who thronged the streets of Drury Lane and Bow Street and brought in their wake a flourishing trade in prostitution. The residing nobility, living at a time where a respectable address was everything, moved further to London's west. And it is here where we begin today's episode. Joining me in the studio today is Barbara Wright. She's a City of Westminster tour guide and an amateur musician. And she has been doing a brand new walk for us called Classical Composers in the West End. And I went on this a couple of weeks ago, being a music fan myself, as I'm sure you all know by now. And it was absolutely riveting. And one of the key people that Barbara talks about is Thomas Arne. And I wanted to know more about him and his London life, and I'm sure you do too. So Barbara is with us today. Hello, Barbara.
Hello, Hazel.
Thomas Arne is a name that people might not know, but they certainly would know some of his music, wouldn't they?
Oh, yes, they would. You'd never guess that he wrote the national anthem, and he wrote a lot of songs that are actually in an English songbook, which if ever you went to a school that had a songbook, it probably had a few of his songs in. He also wrote God Save the Queen. So there you go. So very interesting man, born in Covent Garden.
Covent Garden now, when people think about it, they think of maybe the boutique shops and maybe the Opera House, which of course we touched in episode 82, a ballet in London. But Thomas Arne, most of his life, he's actually spent in and around Covent Garden, isn't he?
Yes, he did. And that to me is one of the most fascinating things about Covent Garden. It used to be more of a place for ordinary people to live. The ordinary people who didn't earn a lot of money, didn't have a lot of money, lived in Covent Garden, and particularly artistic types and particularly musical types, even composers. There were quite a few composers and musicians in the 18th century living in Covent Garden. And Thomas Arne was born at 31 King Street, right bang between Covent Garden Piazza and Leicester Square. Can you imagine that? That's amazing. And his parents were not well off. They were upholsterers, and that was not a rich family. He was born there because they weren't that well off, and this is quite common. His parents, the last thing that they would want him to do is go into anything artistic, because anything artistic meant an insecure life, okay? So his parents wanted him to become a solicitor, and he was articled to be a solicitor. But in secret, he was learning the spinet, which is a kind of harpsichord. And he used to put his handkerchief over it at night so that he could actually practice when the family were asleep.
I was thinking about the practicalities of this because at school we used to put newspaper between the hammers and the strings in order to deaden the sound a little bit. And I'm kind of thinking when we're putting a handkerchief over, maybe he's doing that, a bit like how you put muffles on a bell to minimise the sound.
Yeah.
And so he is up at night. What, is he a teenager by now, is he? Is this what he's doing it?
He was a teenager by this time. And the thing was also what he did was that he was so keen on the opera and the theatre that he dressed up as what was called a liveryman, a sort of smart servant, to go to the theatre and opera. And it was there that he met a man called Michael Vesting, who was also a local composer. He was also a violinist. And he played at it would have been then the Queen's Theatre, Haymarket, played the violin there. He took Thomas Arne under his wing and taught him the violin and also showed him around, gave him contacts. So that was absolutely critical. And the thing about Thomas Arne is that, he was living in this environment which was very packed with people. All day and night there were people. They lived close together, cheek by jowl. That's how it was. Lots of artists, musicians, etc. Lots of visitors. So you couldn't not bump into people. This was the point. Because of that, you bumped into people like yourself who happened to be there because there were so many theatres in that area or musical places. So there was Drury Lane Theatre, there was Covent Garden Opera, and I've obviously mentioned the Haymarket, but also in the 17th and 18th century were growing up lots of places to listen to music, which was not in a church. So pubs particularly. There was a place down on the Strand where you could go to listen to music in a pub. And that was because there was nowhere else to go to start with secular music.
What's an exciting time to live as a teenager?
Yeah.
You're in a place where the arts is alive, literally on your doorstep.
Yeah.
You're being inspired by people that you are going to be bumping into. You're dressing up as a liveryman to go and see these performances. And then you are muffling a spinet and playing it in your bedroom at night when your parents sleep. I mean, he was really following something from the heart, wasn't he?
Yes. And the interesting thing about it particularly was that whereas today, if you were of modest means like that, you wouldn't be able to live in somewhere like Covent Garden and be near all that culture. You'd been living out in the suburbs where only if you got the money to get on the tube and come into London would you experience that buzz, which you get in most capital cities somewhere, but it was particularly like that in the 18th century. So when I walk round Covent Garden and I finished my classical composers walk at Thomas Arne's home at 31 King Street, I often feel I'd like to spend more time there to sort of try to think back to the 18th century of what it would have been like to literally live there as a modest individual who didn't have a lot of money. And that's how it was.
You said his dad was an upholsterer.
Yeah.
And they wanted him to become a solicitor. And that's something parents even say now, isn't it? You know, when you grow up, you can be anything you want to be, as long as it's a doctor, a solicitor, or a dentist. They're the three options. Was he training to be a solicitor and then doing this on the sly? What happened?
He did 3 years of it as an article clerk, I suppose. And then apparently what happened was that his father came upon him at some musical event, soiree or something like that. I don't know whether he was playing music or just watching. So he's sort of caught in the act, as it were. And eventually the parents gave way and let him pursue his musical career. And again, that was Michael Vesting with a V, who was encouraging him he had a mentor basically through Michael. And, you know, if he hadn't been round the corner from him, because Michael lived in Covent Garden as well, you know, it would never have happened. And actually the person who reported this was Francis Burney, and he was also a composer, and he lived in Covent Garden as well. He was the father of Fanny Burney, who's perhaps a little bit more well known. But through, you know, this musical connection, I think you can actually get a feel for the sort of artistic feel, as it were, of Covent Garden at that time, because there were so many composers in that area and people who were musicians, and they just live around the corner from their work, which, of course, it's so difficult to do these days unless you're very well off in somewhere like a big city. So it must have been an amazing place. And also, it was just about the time that I suppose you'd call the middle classes and the aristocracy. Well, the aristocracy always had money, but the middle classes were starting to have a bit of money. And you'd got things like, apart from these pubs where you could go to listen to music, you'd also got, it's further away, but somewhere like the Vauxhall Pleasure Gardens, where you would go to listen to music. And Thomas Arne composed music for places like that. And that would have, again, been a bit of a melting pot. You know, it's like, you know, people in London, and then you go to Ascot. And when you go to Ascot, you bump into everybody again. And I'm sure the Vauxhall Pleasure Gardens would have been like that.
If you've seen Poldark, they have a few scenes at the Pleasure Gardens, but it's got to have been even more fun than that. I mean, you know, hedges which had little bits cut out, so they'd have artwork in the hedges, so you can see like an outdoor gallery, and also, I suppose, dark corners to do dark deeds and live music on the bandstand. You know, we have that now at disco, and you go to the DJ and ask for your favourite tune, don't you? And they were doing exactly the same thing back then, but with the live orchestra. How amazing is that?
It's a pity we can't recreate it. Maybe in festivals we have.
Yes, yeah, maybe. And of course, it wasn't just Vauxhall, it was Ranelagh, Marylebone, and of course, round Islington as well. There were so many pleasure gardens. And music this is where the importance of music and accessibility to music was coming on now. It wasn't just for those who could afford music within their own private home for their guests. This is the first time, I suppose we call it popular music.
Yes. No, it's a fact. It's a great time. And then I've got a bit of a funny example of this thing about being in close proximity, which was apparently, I discovered that there was this thing called the Battle of the Romeos, which was two versions of Romeo and Juliet, which were held. One at Covent Garden and the other at Drury Lane. And Thomas Arne wrote a dirge for the one at Covent Garden. William Boyce, another composer born in Covent Garden, wrote the music to the rival one. He was told to, one weekend, he had to write it sort of by Monday or something. And so he wrote it, and these two productions were going on at the same time. And as a result of Boyce writing he managed to get a bigger audience at the Drury Lane Theatre. So it was a bit of a febrile, if that's the right expression, atmosphere with not just getting on, but also a bit of competition there. All people living together round the corner from each other, not always getting on.
Fantastic. Battle of the Romeos.
Yes, that was 1750 when that war broke out.
Wow. So to put into perspective for everybody else, this is the same time as Handel's about. We've talked about Handel in previous episodes. And of course, we have Hogarth as well, who would have been very active in the area as well. And so you mentioned about him spending much of his life in London. I mean, he was all over the place, wasn't he? So we talked about where he lived on King Street. We've also talked about the Haymarket Theatre. where
Yeah.
he performed at, and also Drury Lane as well, a few years after that. And you mentioned the Pleasure Gardens. He's getting about a bit. Covent Garden Theatre. What about other places?
He wrote pieces for a festival at Stratford.
Is it Stratford upon Avon or Stratford at London?
Stratford upon Avon. So, yes, he wrote for a festival. I think When the Bee Sucks was written for that, and there was something called Soft Flowing Avon, and the Avon flows through Stratford upon Avon. And I'm not sure whether this was also produced for the Shakespeare, but he wrote another famous song, A Hunting We Will Go, which would definitely been in an English song book, and another one less well known, Blow, Blow, Thou Winter Winds. And his style was very, as they say, light and airy, and he had a great sense of melody, and he copied a lot of sort of Irish, Scottish, and also Italian styles in musical songs, which was lovely. He was a bit of an outlier, really, because he wasn't a member of the Church of England. He was actually Catholic. So he was always a bit on the outside of the establishment, because if you were a member of the Catholic Church in those days, you wouldn't have been able to secure a formal position, say, for example, as cathedral organist. So that's possibly why he veered towards the theatre. However, funnily enough, he was eventually, now I think of it, buried in St Paul's Church in Covent Garden, which I'm sure is Church of England. He'd never secured a position, and in those days you had to be in the Church of England if you were going to get anywhere in music. So that would have been difficult for him. But he made a very good career in the theatre, and he is considered to be the most foremost theatrical composer of the 18th century, if not ever. But a lot of his music was burnt and has disappeared, probably because many of the theatres burnt down. They were made of wood. For example, Covent Garden Theatre, where he performed quite a lot, his work, that burnt down twice, and so he would have lost music there. So that was his life. Mainly, it was actually mainly round Covent Garden that he spent his time, in the theatres round there and the pubs in the area.
I think it's what you're saying about him having an ability to write a good tune. I mean, being a singer myself, I've sang Where the Bee Sucks, and I've got it in my head now, and, Hunting We Will Go. They are good tunes, aren't they? I mean, and also, Rule Britannia, you do want to give a good sing-song. I mean, I must admit, when I'm listening to some nouveau music now, I'm waiting for the tune.
But you certainly get a feeling that it was a very lively period for music. And in fact, it's an 18th century music society. If anybody wants to look it up, you can look up all these 18th century composers, and there's an awful lot of them, some of which you might never have heard, but you might know the music, even if you've never heard their names. So that's worth looking up.
There was something special about the placement of Covent Garden as well.
The thing was that it was placed between the city and Westminster, the seat of power. But when Inigo Jones built Covent Garden Piazza in the 1600s, a lot of aristocrats moved in. It was designed for aristocrats, but it was never quite finished. And then they put the market in. So it was a bit of a hodgepodge. And then you had the plague, and 1665, and then the Great Fire of London, 1666. And this helped make the aristocrats quite fearful, and they started to look to move west. And they started to move away from Covent Garden, which allowed rooms for the poorer artistic types to move into. So that's what created a few vacancies, as it were, as the aristocrats moved west towards first Leicester Square, then St James and Mayfair later on. And so that's what created this hub, really. And people came from all over the country to actually live there.
Quite amazing, really, and not just the arts, but also for the coffee houses as well. You think of Samuel Johnson, and
Yes.
yeah, exactly. So a melting pot of all these people, these thinkers, coming together and finding a practical outlet, really.
Yes. I mean, that's what makes what makes a big city so amazing. There is that creative buzz. I mean, they said that during COVID that the IT sector really suffered. That's why you get them, saying everyone has to be near each other to bounce ideas off each other. Although I know now you've got working from home, but that's one of the problems with working from home is that you don't get that creative buzz that you get if you're right beside each other. But I was just going to mention, just think about giving you an idea of the not poverty, but the insecurity of, say, his parents a bit more, because I think that's something that it might be worth emphasising, and what it was like, because there was no state provision in those days. I said his father was an upholsterer, but his grandfather had to go into the Marshalsea debtors prison because he was in huge debt. So they sort of went from that to his father managing to make enough money to send him to Eton. So although they were sort of insecure middle classes, one minute, the grandfather was in a debtor's prison, and the next minute he managed to earn some money. But during his lifetime, his father also was reduced to quite a lot of poverty. So I don't really know how he managed to end up sending him to Eton, but they struggled to do that. It was that narrative, of the family who were determined that he was going to get on. Marshalsea debtors prison to Eton is quite a jump, isn't it? But that was all within sort of 2 or 3 generations.
Yeah, amazing. Especially to think of that. I mean, that on King Street, that's a big house for them to rent, wasn't it?
Yeah, but it would be interesting to find out a bit more about the actual finances of the family. But, anyway, that's apparently the sort of the gap between it. Marshalsea debtors prison up to Eton, quite a jump.
So for those who might recognise the name Marshalsea Prison, it's also where Charles Dickens's father and brother and younger siblings went, and you can still see part of the wall there. But I'm just thinking, as a teenage Thomas Arne, you've been sent to Eton in the 1720s. You've been told to become a man of law, and all you want to do is make music. And that your grandfather had been in debtor's prison. There's a lot of pressure on your shoulders to become someone who inherently you're not.
Yes. William Boyce and Arne, they had rivalry that went beyond that battle of the Romeos. So why that was, but it might make you super sensitive and ambitious and determined that you were going to make it, even if it was in a different profession. I think that's quite common. I think Shakespeare was like that a bit, absolutely determined to get on because you'd been slighted quite a lot earlier on.
Link with Shakespeare, he wanted to make money there and then. He wasn't thinking about his name living on in 500 years' time. Is that the same for Arne? Did he make it financially?
He married a lady who was a soprano singer. He also taught his sister to sing. Then he fell out with his wife and then got together again before he died. And his son, they had a son, and the son became a composer. So I think that if his son became a composer, they must have had enough money to keep in the music tradition. So I don't think he ever became. I don't get the feeling he ever became really rich. But I think that he was sort of reasonably comfortable, I would imagine, from his music. But he probably had to be careful with money. They kept themselves together they mixed more or less just with each other. Not some. I mean, they did a bit with the artists. Vic Gartrell, I will quote from him, says they were thought of as craftsmen of the middling kind and earned little. It would be an interesting comparison to have a look at, how much money everybody actually had.
Very different time now, where you're not relying on patrons with that private music. You've got to be a populist. You've got to write for the masses in order to get the money, haven't you? A couple of pence from each person all adds up in the end.
But there was this slow, gradual development of music as an actual profession, because, it took till the 1820s and then the 1880s. You've got the Royal Academy of Music and the Royal College of Music were developed. So it was into the 1800s before you actually had a formal place to go and learn music, as opposed to learning it from an actual patron. Apparently, Francis Burney had 3 years learning off Thomas Arne. So that's the way you presumably did it. And then Thomas Arne learnt off Vesting. So that's the way you were actually learning music then. And in terms of the number of musicians and sort of my theory that they were starting to professionalise, there was this thing called the Universal Directory, which might be a bit like Kelly's Directory, which I think has disappeared. But when I was first at work, we used Kelly's Directory in my job, and it was bright red, I remember. But anyway, the 1763 Universal Directory listed 95 masters and professors of music across London, 1763. And it said many of them actually lived in Covent Garden. So that to me is an indication you were starting to get people who actually taught music as a living. And clearly Thomas Arne was teaching music and getting paid for it, as well as composing music for the theatres and the pleasure gardens, and presumably playing as well, although you hear more of his composing. For example, he produced some songs for a later version of the Beggar's Opera, John Rich's Beggar's Opera, which was first produced in 1728. I think it's about 1750. Thomas Arne, his songs were in another Covent Garden version later on. So they were constantly revising and improving operas, for example. And he wrote Italian opera himself. He's got one called, I think it's called Rosamond. That was his first one. But, a lot of them have when I say disappeared, we don't hear of them, but we do hear of God Save the Queen and a few of these lovely songs which have survived into our heritage as I think quintessentially English, actually.
I'm just thinking, what a wonderful work, because you're talking about Charles Burney. So if you think of Evelina being written by Fanny Burney, and Charles being a student of Arne, and he's one of the first musical historians I learnt about.
Yes.
And then when you throw into the melting pot, obviously Susanna, Arne's sister, she was a big favourite, including Handel. Handel absolutely loves Susanna. And she got on really well with David Garrick, who also lived in Covent Garden.
Wow.
And she was on the stage for him at Drury Lane and that. So they're all moving around in a very small circle.
Yeah.
And on Sunday nights, there were musical soirees at Susanna's house. I'm not quite sure if she's actually living with her brother Thomas, because it's a big house there, isn't it?
Yes.
And all having a good old sing-song on a Sunday night.
Yes.
And making their own fantastic music.
Yes. Well, they also had these things called, have you heard of Glee clubs?
Yes.
Right, an early drinking club where you would sing songs. Yeah. And apparently there were a lot of those around Covent Garden. So that would have, So, Sunday night seems to be music night, doesn't it? In fact, isn't there I think there used to be a programme on the radio called, Sunday Night is Music Night, I remember.
Really?
Yeah, there was. And actually, thinking about it, my grandfather, who was a very good violinist, they used to apparently get round the piano on a Sunday. It was Sunday night. So we got round and, because people had instruments, even relatively modestly well-off people might have the odd instrument around.
Yeah.
And they would just pick it up and play it because there was no TV, and sing.
Oh, of course. Mm-hmm. Well, when I lived in Covent Garden, I used to go to the Coach and Horses in Soho for Sing at the Piano on a Sunday night.
Really? Did you?
Yeah, indeed.
Oh.
So there you go, you see. Fantastic. Well, that is brilliant, Barbara. Thank you very much for sharing the life of Thomas Arne.
Yes. Well, I hope it's given a bit more of a feel for maybe something about how it might have felt to live in Covent Garden from certainly a musician's point of view, but also what it was like as a place.
That's all we've got time for now. If you want to continue the music tradition, then have a listen to episodes 17, The Proms and the Royal Albert Hall, and also episodes 63 and 57 about Handel's time in London. And of course, episode 82 is where we talk about ballet in Covent Garden. And in the show notes, along with the transcript, I've also added links to Barbara's Classical Composers in the West End Walk, a blog that she's also written about Ivor Novello, and also some photos as well, so you can have a little look there. That's all for now. See you next time.